Do you think that the goals of affirmative action are feasible without affirmative action?
No.
I went to college as a result of affirmative action, and I can't imagine right now how that's going to work, seeing how the society is structured.
Clarence Thomas would not be where he is today if it was not for affirmative action. There's no colorblind in America.
Why now? Why did they take up that case?
I think sometimes when you are popular and you're hanging with rich people, you don't recognize that racism exists.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a significant rise in white students and a decline in number of Black and Hispanic and other community students, which is terrible. And I think students will always find a university to go to, but they will probably come down to tier, which will affect job prospects, which will, have repercussions over the years.
It's Notes from America. I'm Kai Wright. Welcome to the show. We are going to have a couple conversations this week about the Supreme Court's ruling ending race-based affirmative action. And the first is about the ideas articulated in the justices' opinions, because for me, the logic behind the ruling is as consequential as the fact of it. Ideas matter, and not just as a legal concern. How we define any problem informs how we imagine solutions to it. The ideas in the court's majority and concurring opinions on affirmative action have a long and consequential history, and given the power of this court, maybe they have quite a future too. To wrap our heads around them, I'm joined by historian Ibram X. Kendi. He's the director of Boston University's Center for Anti-Racist Research and author of a growing list of best-selling books, including How to Be an Anti-Racist and his epic National Book Award-winning work, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas. And by the way, a graphic novel adaptation of Stamped has just come out. So Ibram, you remain a very busy man. Thanks for coming back on the show.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
So let's talk about the ideas in these opinions. You have written about them extensively. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the majority opinion on affirmative action, and he's been an opponent for decades. But more than that, he's been making a version of the argument he offered in this decision for decades, which is, in sum, any effort to consider race in making public policy is itself an act of racial discrimination. So in Stamped, in your writing since the ruling in The Atlantic, you've traced the long and winding history of versions of this idea. I want to start with the recent history because in the book, you quote Newt Gingrich saying something in 1997 that sounds exactly like the Supreme Court in 2023. He said, quote, racism will not disappear by focusing on race. So take us back to the mid to late 90s. Why did you point to there as the modern evolution of what you call colorblind racism? How did this thing emerge in today's politics?
So I believe it was in 1997 when President Clinton at the time decided to lead what he called a national conversation on race and really on racism. And Republicans, by and large, challenged that decision by stating that race was no longer a factor, that racism didn't exist, that the nation was colorblind. And the term colorblind, in reaction to President Clinton's national conversation on race, and he put together this committee, which I believe was chaired by the eminent historian John Hope Franklin, but that was the reaction, that we don't need to discuss race, let alone eliminate race, because the nation is colorblind.
And I think about, this word colorblind. I think about, I grew up in the in the 80s and early 90s. And I just remember how people used to say proudly, like, I'm colorblind. I'm colorblind. I do not see race. And that was proof of an evolved posture on race relations. And I always felt some kind of way when I heard it as a young man, even though I didn't really have the words or the language for why it was bothering me. Is this related to that? Do you remember that, how that used to be the thing that people would say, just individuals? Is this related to what we're talking about here in terms of what the colorblind racism that you're describing?
It is, and I think you had many people who were fed this mistaken belief that the problem isn't racism, isn't racial disparities, isn't racial inequities that we can empirically document, that the problem is talking about race, is merely identifying by race. And if we somehow stop identifying by race, if we stop talking about race, then apparently race will go away. That's like saying if we stop talking about cancer as a cancer survivor, that suddenly this epidemic of cancer will go away. I mean, it was a folly then, and it remains a folly.
Right. But the idea as it emerged as sort of a political thing, moving from, and I'm interested in this dichotomy between like what, the common sense thing that I can imagine, individuals who are not, students of racist ideas say, oh yeah, great. I shouldn't be thinking about race. That's a very straightforward and common sense sounding thing. And then how that becomes a political tool for reversing public policy. Go ahead.
Well, it became a political tool largely because by the 1960s and especially the 1970s, a growing number of people who recognized widespread racial disparities also recognized that we could not eliminate those racial disparities by ignoring them. We actually needed to take affirmative action in order to close those racial gaps. And so those who wanted to conserve those racial disparities tried to say that, no, you who are trying to close, those who I should say were trying to conserve those disparities, said those who were trying to reduce them are the new problem. I mean, it was nonsensical. But many of the people who claim color blindness or who advocate for race neutrality have no plan for reducing racial disparities and typically state Black, Brown, and Indigenous people are underrepresented at the most selective colleges because there's something wrong and inferior about them. The very people who say race is not an issue hold racist ideas.
In those late 90s, when mid to late 90s, when Bill Clinton was holding his conversation on race, and Newt Gingrich began ranting for colorblindness. One of the things arguments that you make in the book is that we were at a unique moment of surge in anti-racism and anti-racist organizing and consensus around anti-racist ideas. Can you just make that case? And that thus this was something of a backlash. I don't know if people remember that moment. Can you, what are you talking about there?
Yeah, so we're talking about the early, I should say the late 1980s and the early 1990s. That was the rise of conscious hip hop. That was the rise of Black studies in colleges and universities. That was the rise of critical race theory in law schools. That was the rise of all sorts of anti-racist Black and Indigenous and Native organizations who were clamoring for self-determination and power. And of course, there was a tremendous backlash that stated, no, the problem isn't racism. The problem are these people who are organizing against racism. And that sounds very familiar to this day.
Yeah, the backlash part of it certainly sounds very familiar to it today. Walking backwards through this history, so we're in the in the 80s and 90s, this idea of colorblindness starts becoming a political tool. Walking back through this history, you write in Stamped from the Beginning about the Supreme Court's 1978 ruling that upheld race-based affirmative action, but with this important change in the logic, it was now justified because it created diverse campuses, which was seen as a benefit for all students. That's very different from something that sought to counter the racist practices that had kept particularly black students out of many universities. I think a lot of people are probably familiar with that case now. It's come up a lot in the debate over the latest ruling. But I don't hear a lot about the dissenting opinions from the liberal justices in that case. And in your book, you point to Harry Blackman, who wrote, I want to quote this. He wrote in his dissenting opinion, "In order to get beyond racism, we must first take account of race. There is no other way. And in order to treat some persons equally, we must treat them differently." And I was revisiting that after this ruling. I was going back through your book and I was revisiting that, and I thought, oh, it is impossible to imagine a public official saying something like that today. Do you agree with me? It just felt like a time capsule from another planet.
Indeed, and I think you have some elected officials who speed around the bush, but Justice Blackmun said it very directly, and I agree. It'd be hard pressed for many elected officials, even those who are defending affirmative action, to say that today.
Is it still an anti-racist idea in 2023?
Without question. I mean, this isn't. I mean, we of course can talk about race and racism, but any social or political problem, there's no way in which we can identify it and solve it by ignoring it, by not attacking it and addressing it head on.
Yeah. I asked this question also because it does feel like affirmative action, like this ruling, is the end of an era, but it's also the question of which era, right? I mean, the era of diversity, I guess, is ending, and maybe the era of equity ended with Justice Blackmun's dissent. Am I overstating that case? I mean, we're going to talk about this later, but I'm curious what you think.
Well, let me just say what I hope. I think what I hope, and I've actually already started to see signs of this, but what I hope is this is the end of a time in which those of us who are serious about racial justice are agreeing with the logic that there's race neutrality. I think since this decision, you've had more and more people who've spoken out against, for instance, legacy admissions, and recognize the ways in which legacies provide racial preferences to white students. They've spoken out against benefits to relatives of donors. So I think people hopefully are beginning to recognize that affirmative action was not the only admissions factor that was considering race.
We got to take a break. I'm talking with historian and author Ibram X. Kendi about the ideas raised in the Supreme Court's ruling that ended race-based affirmative action in college admissions. Later in the show, we're going to turn to these questions about diversity versus equity and what it really means to create equity in higher education, and we will take your calls on that question too. More with Ibram Kendi after a break. Stay with us. Welcome back. It's Notes from America. I'm Kai Wright, and I'm talking with Ibram X. Kendi, director of Boston University's Center for Anti-Racist Research and author of Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas, for which there is now a graphic novel adaptation to go along with the children's book version and a young adult version. And Ibram, you know, I do think the way you framed this whole Stamped project is really notable, that it's a history of ideas behind racism. I don't think I've asked you before why you felt the world needed an exhaustive chronicle of racist ideas rather than just, you know, the history of what happened.
I think because I realized that, well, let me just say there's a number of different reasons. I'll just give two. One, because I noticed through the research that there were many people who held both racist and anti-racist ideas, oftentimes said either or both in the same speech, in the same paragraph of the same speech. And so it would have been hard to write a history of, quote, racists or anti-racists. I also thought it was important to really track who produced these ideas and why, and what type of impact did they have on society, and what type of impact did society have on these ideas?
Yeah. And one of the ideas, one of the racist ideas that you most directly commented on following the Supreme Court's ruling on affirmative action was the doctrine of separate but equal. You wrote about this in The Atlantic. This is, of course, the idea that made racial segregation legal in the first place. How do the ideas in the court's affirmative action ruling have their lineage in separate but equal?
Well, ironically, Chief Justice John Roberts, in his majority opinion in the affirmative action case recently, talked about the notion that the schools were separate but equal was an inherent folly. And because everybody knew schools were not separate but equal. And I would argue that the lineage is that everyone should know that there are other admissions factors other than affirmative action that give preferential treatment, but almost all of the other ones give preferential treatment to white and wealthy students. Affirmative action is the only admissions factor that primarily benefits Black, Brown, and Indigenous students. And unfortunately, he framed all those other admissions factors as race neutral, which to me is just as much of a folly as the idea a century ago that these schools, which were obviously unequal, were somehow equal.
And I guess for help people with just a step more of that, because I think it's people hear things like, well, you know, that's just like separate but equal, and think, well, that's ancient history. That's, that is forever ago. And that is a dead and gone idea. And how could you possibly listen to John Roberts saying, hey, just like, let's treat everybody the same, and think, well, that's just like Jim Crow. Just do the math a little more for people.
Sure. So John Roberts said again and again that affirmative action was the only race-based admissions factor. So standardized tests, which studies consistently show that they don't actually predict who's going to do well in college or even graduate school, but they do predict the test, the wealth or the income of the parents of the test takers. And we have a massive racial wealth gap in this country, which then allows white and wealthy students to be able to use high-priced test prep courses, which then boost their scores. So to imagine that a standardized test is somehow race neutral denies the racial wealth gap, denies what studies show in terms of what standardized test scores predict. Similarly for legacies. And I think a lot of people have been talking about a study that was conducted at Harvard, which found that a large percentage of their white students either were admitted as the result of being the children of alumni, the relatives of donors, athletes, or even the children of employees. And indeed, the study found that about 3/4 of white students, if they didn't have those 4 admissions boosts, would not have gotten admitted. And all 4 of those elements give preferential treatment to white students. White students have the ability to get boosted because their parents are more likely to be on the faculty and staff. Their parents are more likely to donate. Their parents were not shut out of these schools for hundreds of years like Black and Indigenous students. And white students are more likely to be playing high-priced sports that gets them into colleges. So to imagine those factors are race neutral, again, flies in the face of reality.
So it's in looking at something plainly, with plainly inequitable outcomes, calling it neutral, but then once the word race is said, saying that's racist, and that's the same ideas as that supported Jim Crow in the first place.
Exactly, because remember, a century ago, Mississippi and Alabama were saying that their schools were separate but equal. Just as people are saying that these other admissions factors are neutral.
Right. You work in a university setting, obviously. Stepping back from the history and just talking about yourself and your students, what was your reaction to the court's ruling?
I mean, it was devastating because I know that it's going to be harder for highly qualified Black, Brown, and Indigenous students, and even many low-income Asian and white students to get into, a selective university like Boston University and others, like it. And I know that many selective universities have directly or indirectly stated that they're going to use more sort of income-based or zip code-based factors. But one of the things we wrote about in that article in The Atlantic is how even when you use class-based factors, you're still likely to benefit white students because white students are less likely, I should say low-income white students are less likely to live in highly impoverished neighborhoods. Their parents are less likely to have to send their kids to lesser resource schools. And so they're going to benefit too, even by this new effort.
You went to Florida A&M University for college, FAMU, a historically Black university. I wonder if there's been some discussion now about in the wake of this about, why are we focused on these selective white majority institutions so much? Shouldn't we be supporting stuff like explicitly pro-Black spaces like HBCUs instead? You want to wade into that debate at all before I let you go?
Well, I think we could do both. I mean, I think we can promote and enhance and defend HBCUs as just as valuable, if not more valuable than many historically white college universities, while also knowing that students who live on the West Coast or the Midwest or the Northeast who want to stay close to home, they don't have options to go to an HBCU. And so we should ensure that the admissions factors are fair and equal for them.
Ibram X. Kendi is director of Boston University's Center for Anti-Racist Research. He's the author of the best-selling book, How to Be Anti-Racist, and the National Book Award-winning Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas, for which there is now a graphic novel adaptation. Ibram, thanks so much for this time.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Let's turn now to the question of what this ruling does or doesn't mean for equity in higher education moving forward. And listeners, I want to hear from you. If you're getting ready to apply for college, or if you're helping someone with that process as a parent or guardian or school advisor, call us up. How do you think the ruling impacts your process? 844-745-TALK. That's 844-745-8255. 8255, or if you're watching on YouTube, you can drop it in the chat. And joining me for this conversation is Dominique Baker, Associate Professor of Education Policy at Southern Methodist University. Her research focuses on equity in higher education. Dominique, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I am also joined again by the National Book Award winning professor Imani Perry, who has just joined Harvard University as a professor of African and African American studies and studies of women, gender, and sexuality. And Imani, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Dominique, can you start off with some basics here? You have studied affirmative action and a host of other policies for equity in higher ed. How should we be thinking about the ruling and its impact? You said we should be careful not to overstate its power. What do you mean by that?
So I think there are sort of two pieces we can think about with this ruling. The first is that there will be a real decrease in the share of Black and Brown and Indigenous students who are enrolling at a set of institutions across the country, thinking about the institutions in this case, right? Harvard, UNC, all those sorts of things. But that those institutions are fairly small number of the institutions across the country, and they enroll a very small portion of the college students in the United States. So one of the things that I actually think about when I think about the broader impact of this ruling is actually thinking about the chilling effect that this will have on other colleges and universities across the country.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, it's that we frequently see, we saw this in 2003 after the Michigan Supreme Court cases, that institutions often go above and beyond what the letter of the law requires of them. So even though this, the opinion may say this is only about admissions, and there are still ways that you can consider and think about how individuals have experienced their race, what we can see, we saw this in 2003, we're already starting to see it now, is you'll see people say things like, well, we can't consider race when it comes to scholarships. We can't consider race when it comes to hiring. And those are not actually detailed in the opinion, but because institutions get really scared about litigation and things of that nature, they can go above and beyond what the law requires of them and wind up curtailing race-conscious practices far beyond the scope of what SCOTUS actually told them they had to do.
I want to get into that a little bit more, but Imani, to bring you into the conversation, after the ruling dropped, you tweeted a question that I think is also a useful baseline for our conversation. You asked, what is the function of American higher education? Is it merely a zone of capitalistic competition, or do we hope that it serves to create a competent and decent body of professionals to serve their societies and their communities? Yes. Why is that the question that was on your mind right after the ruling?
Well, it was really this sort of simultaneous, I think what both what Ibram and Dominique have said is absolutely true. There's these sort of two dynamics at work here. So one is the question of race-based affirmative action being narrowly tailored to such an extent that it may not actually be able to function any longer. And then the other is this case around student loan forgiveness. And simultaneously, what the pressures are then become for the roughly 120 schools that are selective in some form or another, that it will be dramatically more difficult for students of color, particularly Black and Indigenous students, to be admitted. And at the same time, we have a public sector which is failing students because of having this unbelievable debt that the Supreme Court also struck down the capacity to alleviate that. Now, there's some ways around that potentially. So the question came to my mind because you're essentially saying, well, these wealthy institutions that actually have the resources to fund students, those can no longer serve these groups, and these students that are that are public institutions that have a responsibility to serve all of the nation's young people, those are also becoming cost prohibitive. And so for me, the question of what is the function of education comes to the fore. And I just have to say, I think it's really important to keep in mind that systematically Black people have been taxed for public education, including at the higher education level, all through history. It only begins to open up in the late 60s. Within 10 years, you have the Bakke decision, right? So the way I put it is I and my family am the only generation that was able to benefit from affirmative action and have access to public higher education fully. And now the question, competitive public higher education. And now for my children, it's being suggested that there is too much remedy that has been offered. One generation in response to multiple generations of systematic exclusion and also systematic processes of limiting the capacity for Black people to accumulate the kind of wealth that might have made other ways of getting access possible.
I hadn't, well, there's so much in there to unpack, but I hadn't thought about, I'm ashamed to say, the two rulings together, the student loan ruling and the affirmative action ruling together in the way that you've just outlined it. That is important food for thought. Listeners, I actually want to broaden our call out with that in mind. I'm interested in both of those rulings and how they affect you. If you are getting ready to apply for college, or if you're helping someone in that process, or a parent, a guardian, a school advisor, whoever you are, thinking about both the affirmative action ruling and the ruling on that limited the student loan forgiveness, how's that showing up in your process? Has it shown up in any way, shape, or form? 844-745-TALK. That's 844-745-8255. You can drop it in YouTube if you're watching there. Do you want to, Dominique, give us a quick reaction also to the student loan forgiveness ruling? This is also right in your wheelhouse. What's your top line response when you saw that ruling?
Yeah, it wasn't great. That was my top line response. So I both study race conscious admissions and I study student loans and debt cancellation. And so it's sort of a 1-2 punch. I completely agree with everything that Imani is saying, that these pieces work together. These decisions work together. I think that you have to read and think about the opinions for each case together. And think about what it means for our future. What does it mean when we think about the fact that we've sort of created a pathway to stability and prosperity in our country that runs through higher education, but we've also created a sort of way that the only way that most people can gain access now is through taking on a massive amount of student loan debt, that where we ignore all of these sort of larger systems that we've put into place previously for centuries that make it so that certain students are unable to attend the institutions that have the most money to provide for scholarships, for institutional grants. So they wind up taking out more debt and wind up more likely to default afterwards. So to me, they work perfectly hand in glove with one another to create a world where we sort of say that there's one pathway to prosperity, and we are only going to open that up for certain students.
We're going to take a break. I'm talking with Imani Perry, Harvard University professor of African and African American Studies and the studies for the studies of women, gender, and sexuality. I'm also joined by Dominique Baker, whose research on education policy at Southern Methodist University has focused specifically on equity in higher ed. And after the break, we will also begin to take your calls if you are getting ready to apply for college, or if you're helping someone in that process. How has the Supreme Court's rulings on either affirmative action or on student loan relief affected your process or your thinking? 844-745-TALK. That's 844-745-8255. Stay with us. Welcome back. It's Notes from America. I'm Kai Wright, and we are talking about the end of race-based affirmative action and the Supreme Court's ruling on student loan relief. What's the Supreme Court's ruling really mean, and who does it really impact? We can take your calls if you're getting ready to apply for college or if you're helping someone with that process. How does these rulings I'm sorry, I'm all over the place. How do these rulings affect your process? 844-745-TALK. That's 844-745-8255. You don't have to be nervous to call because the host can't even read a script. I'm joined by Imani Perry, newly of Harvard University, and Dominique Baker of Southern Methodist University. And let's go right to Harmon in Fargo, North Dakota. Harmon, welcome to the show.
Hi. Thank you.
So how have either of these rulings affected you?
Well, first of all, I was going to call on about the affirmative action ruling, but I believe the student loan debt one is also extremely important. I am a recent college graduate. I personally do not have a significant amount of student loan debt. The person in my family who does is my mother, and statistically, a lot of student loan debt is actually held by Gen Xers, and I believe that can also affect the next generation of college students. But beyond that, as far as affirmative action is concerned, even back in my high school days, I remember, as a white man, a lot of comments from other white students about, very nonchalant about applying to college, about the notion of, other people are more likely to get in than me, so why would I bother, of course, being on the race issue, which it always confused me because it seemed extremely defeatist. And I hear those same sentiments were echoed when I was helping my little brother apply to Texas A&M University, which is a university I believe particularly has a very interesting history with racism and barring Black students. I definitely agree with the comment earlier about the path to prosperity being gridlocked out, because I feel like to a certain extent, whenever white students don't make it into universities, it provides a very convenient scapegoat to be able to just say, oh, probably a Black student got an affirmative action, so I shouldn't have even bothered trying. And of course, as you were saying earlier, and Ibram Kendi was saying earlier, you have all these relatives of alumni, relatives of donors that are getting past that post first. I think it definitely, that racialized blame system gets ingrained very early into people's minds during the college admission process as a way of essentially blaming a third party that had nothing to do with it.
Gets ingrained in people's minds early in the process. Dominique or Imani, do you want to talk about that, the way these ideas get ingrained in people's minds in the process of applying for college?
Absolutely. It's a very deliberate political strategy. So there's abundant research that demonstrates that the impact of race-based affirmative action, I think at most highly selective institutions, is on the order of 1%, right? So that there's a relatively infinitesimal impact of a race-based affirmative action on the likelihood of a white student being admitted. But of course, all of those other factors mentioned earlier have a much greater impact. And then I think the larger question, though, is even what that idea means sort of easier to get in, right? So once you're not controlling for all of the other forces that shape how the student looks when they come to the application process, right? All the other forces of inequality that operate on every level, even at the level of the classroom, right? We have abundant evidence that in classroom racial discrimination impacts grades. So there's both district-wide discrimination, there's within school discrimination, and there's even in-class discrimination. So the idea that there's some kind of unfairness is really, not only is it untrue, but the narrative is consistent with this long history of sort of blaming Black people for any form of adversity, which is really about a possessive investment in whiteness, right? And the advantages of whiteness, not just the sort of abstract notion of fairness.
Dominique, you want to chime in?
I was just going to throw in, I think this is actually a perfect example because you mentioned that you helped your brother with an application to Texas A&M and that this was ingrained. But in the 90s, Texas actually, through a court order, stopped considering race in admissions. Because it was through a court order, when the 2003 Michigan cases happened, it actually sort of invalidated that. And so institutions in Texas got to choose whether or not they wanted to consider race in admissions, and Texas A&M decided not to. So it's funny, right, that that's a piece that's talked about when it comes to your brother's application, because Texas A&M is not an institution that considers race in their admissions process.
That really is. There it is. But let me ask you this, Dominique. This is a comment from YouTube, and I think this is the question that a lot of people come to with affirmative action. Someone asks, if there should be more of a socioeconomic distinction between students from different ethnic backgrounds, and if more of the focus should be on the descendants of persons who were enslaved and indigenous tribes. How for people who are, that's a very common reaction to this. What is your reaction to that question?
Yeah. So I think sort of twofold. One, I always think it's important to keep in mind that when we say systemic racism, we mean systemic racism, right? So we mean that there are things that happen to people that we have structured systems in our society to benefit white supremacy. And that is true regardless of how much money the people who are not white have. And so that's important when thinking about the way that racism works in our country. Having said that, it's really interesting because I often hear people say, well, instead of thinking about race-conscious admissions, what we should do is really focus on socioeconomic status. We should really only focus on this income piece. And the part that's challenging there is most of this, in fact, all of the studies that look at simulations of socioeconomic status and looking at sort of class-conscious admissions, they show a significant decrease in the racial diversity of incoming classes. Because exactly as Ibram was saying earlier, what happens is you admit more white low-income students in particular. And so it is not the case that you can just automatically substitute out class for race and think that you're necessarily getting the same outcomes.
You have to name the race in it.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go to Abdi in Minnesota. Abdi, welcome to the show. And am I pronouncing your name correctly? Maybe I'm not, so that you're not noticing.
Are.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, and I think we just lost Abdi in the course of that. That's unfortunate. Let's go to Linda in Portland, Oregon. Linda, welcome to the show.
Hi.
You want to share with us how either of these rulings have affected your journeys through school?
Well, I want to give people hope and encourage them to consider working and getting either their first 2 years education through community college, which is how I got through school and got 2 degrees, or working full-time in a job and just doing it in night studies for a number of years. And I just discovered in old papers that my partner and I had stored from the family. Her aunt had put herself through library science a degree out here in Portland by going to night school. And here were all these wonderful, credits by credits that she had accumulated because she came from a family that was an immigrant family that didn't have money to just, go to college all at once. So she did it little by little and had no student debt. And the same with me. I didn't have money to apply for college and go through university. So I went through community college first and then was able to get jobs that paid really quite well for my needs. And if I wanted to go back and get a master's or a doctorate, I now could. But
Linda, can I ask you when?
Go ahead.
Can I ask you? Is it okay to ask you when this occurred? When? At what time period were these? When both your aunt and you were able to do that?
I think we need to quit worrying about, quote, offending people. We need to be able to talk with people and have different points of view. So let's see. I went to school in the 60s, and my partner's aunt would have gone to work in, it would have been post-World War II, when women didn't have any jobs to speak of, so it was really hard to get money together. And I would mention this too. When I was younger, my partner and I were at a hardware store, and there was, since this is primarily a show directed towards young black people, but the guy that waited on us at the hardware store wanted to be a cartoonist, and well, he happened to be black, I don't think in those terms. But my partner said, well, you've got to go back to school and get a degree in art. So he did a part-time thing through the University of Washington and got his degree in fine arts in from the 4-year college. And then he was able to become a cartoonist.
I'm going to stop you there, Linda, and I thank you for that call. And just to clarify, this is a show for everybody, not just young black people, but I really hope there's a lot of young black people listening. Imani, you're trying to jump in.
Yes. Yeah, I think this is really important. It's the historical context. I'm so glad you asked Kai about the time period because so in the 1960s, so my family, as the vast majority of African Americans in this country, was in the South. No one in my family could go to a state university. A majority white state university they were legally prohibited, and those, when they desegregated, there was a violent retaliation, right? So even in that time period, that option was not available in the same way. It also, the job landscape was not comparable. Black women in Alabama, where my family was, were hired as domestics. They worked in agricultural labor, and maybe sometimes they worked in education, but in Black segregated schools, right? And a small number had other kinds of professions, but those were very narrow access points, right? What we see today is that public education, so I think I agree, community college is a wonderful vehicle to four-year education, but public education, public higher education is being underfunded. So the consequence of not having a robust public higher education system, many community colleges that don't have direct pathways to four-year institutions, combined with labor market discrimination of the sort that, economists estimate whiteness is worth like 3 or 4 more years of education, literally, in terms of job markets. There's studies that suggest that Black people with a high school diploma are less likely to be called back for a job than white people with criminal records who dropped out of high school. Right. Which is not to suggest that the pathway that Linda set forth isn't a meaningful one, but that actually does not address the problem of inequality.
The other reason I asked about the time period, Dominique, is I wonder, is that in today's time period possible for anybody in terms of the costs and the kinds of the cost of education, even public education? What is different, if anything, in the landscape today from the time that Linda has described?
So that's exactly what I was thinking as well, is that the price to attend college has risen astronomically. And one of the issues that actually Imani was just touching on is that when public underfunding begins to happen, it sort of accelerates. And so the state is not providing as much money to public institutions. Those institutions actually raise their tuition prices. We have very good economics research that shows this. So what that means is community college does not cost the same in 2023 that it cost in the 60s, in part because we have underfunded our public institutions. And so that means that it is more expensive to go to college in present day, which makes it really challenging for people to sort of take the path that Linda did. But it's also the case that because there's less funding at community colleges, it means sometimes, right, classes are oversubscribed. There's too many people signed up. They don't have enough money to hire people to teach. And so students, when they're trying to think about night school and things of that nature, instead of going to the public community college, they go to for-profit institutions. And we have very robust research on for-profit institutions, particularly from Tracy McMillan Cottom, that show the way that those students are charged just an exceptional amount of money, and are not as likely to complete a credential. So then they wind up taking out a significant amount of debt, but they don't get the boost from getting a credential so that they might get a job that has better earnings. So it is a much more difficult road to travel in 2023 to find an affordable college education by sort of doing a mixture of night courses and community college courses.
And Dominique, so the facts are, as I understand them, help me if this is right, the vast, vast, vast majority of students that go to college do not go to any of the selective schools that are involved in the affirmative action debate. So that's of any race. And so I guess my question is, does this, when we think about the affirmative action ruling and the amount of political energy that's attached to it and the feelings that we all have attached to it, does it matter for the vast majority of students? There's these financial things that we're talking about, but on the affirmative action question, how does it matter to the vast majority who do not go to who will never go to these selective schools?
So I think that's spot on. You know, one of the things I always tell people is when we're thinking about this set of institutions that have really small acceptance rates, that on average their entering classes are about 1,500 students. So they are not educating a large portion of people who are going to colleges and universities, right? But I'll come back to the point I was talking about a little bit earlier. These ripple effects, these chilling effects that these cases can have matter a lot. It took less than 2 days for state attorneys general to begin asking questions to public university systems about whether or not they should be using race when they are considering for financial aid, when they are looking at employment. And that is even though the opinion literally says this is only related to admissions decisions. And so it is a very real concern, I think, when we look at sort of the fabric across the country, we can see cases like this, adding to Florida's Stop Woke Act, adding to the DEI ban in Texas, that they all start to work together to try to, quite frankly, uphold the power and sort of supremacy of white students within colleges and universities. So even though we are talking about a select group of institutions that admit a small number of students, that doesn't diminish the attacks that are happening on the tools to try to advocate for racial justice in this country.
And Imani, in the minute or so we've got left, you are in one of the most elite institutions in the country, if not the world. Why should, it's a similar version of this question, why should a racial justice question such as access to university education, why should access to elite universities be part of that conversation in the first place?
Right. Well, I mean, I think the reality is that we have a profoundly unequal society, and access to elite universities has consequences for who become the people who are actually in positions of power and authority. And if people of color, significant numbers of Black and Indigenous people, are not in that group, it does have significant impact on the rest of the society. Now, were I to create the perfect world, I believe that we should invest in all institutions. I believe that every university can be made an excellent university, and it doesn't require a high degree of selectivity, but that's not the world that we live in. And so if the idea, these elite universities say that their vision is to educate the world, to impact the world, and they have a responsibility to respond to the world as it is and to include everyone.
Imani Perry is Harvard University Professor of African and African American Studies and for the study of women, gender, and sexuality. Dominique Paker is Associate Professor of Education Policy at Southern Methodist University. Thanks to you both for this time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Notes from America is a production of WNYC Studios. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts and on Instagram at Notes with Kai. Theme music by Jared Paul. Matthew Mirando is our live engineer. Our team also includes Billy Estreen, Karen Frillman, Regina DeHeer, Rahima Nassa, Kusha Navadar, and Lindsay Foster Thomas. Andre Robert Lee is our executive producer. I'm Kai Wright.